The village of Thornwick existed in perpetual twilight, nestled between mountains so steep they seemed to claw at the sky and forests so dense that sunlight barely penetrated their canopy. For generations, the villagers had lived according to strict rules. Never enter the Blackwood Forest after sunset. Never speak the name of the creature that dwelled within. Never, under any circumstances, approach the ancient stone circle at the forest's heart. These weren't suggestions passed down through cheerful bedtime stories, but commandments etched into survival itself, written in the blood of those foolish enough to forget them. The elders spoke in hushed tones about the beast that haunted those woods, a wolf of impossible size with eyes that burned like molten gold and a howl that could freeze the bravest heart. Children had vanished over the years, their toys found at the forest's edge, their laughter silenced forever. The creature was called many things: the Shadow of Thornwick, the Blackwood Devil, the Cursed One, but everyone knew the truth even if they dared not voice it. Something ancient and terrible made those woods its domain, and it hungered. 7-year-old Arya understood fear differently than most children. Perhaps it was because she had already experienced the worst kind of loss. Watching her parents succumb to the wasting sickness that had swept through Thornwick 3 winters prior, leaving her an orphan in a village that viewed her with suspicion. Her hair was, the color of moonlight on snow, an unnatural silver that no dye could explain, and her eyes held a violet hue that seemed to shift in different light. The village women whispered that she was touched by something otherworldly, that her strange coloring marked her as cursed or blessed, depending on who you asked. Arya lived with old Miriam, a widow who took her in more out of duty than affection, and spent her days doing chores and her nights staring at the forest that everyone else avoided. While other children cowered at tales of the beast, Arya felt something different when she looked toward those dark trees. Recognition. Longing. As if something within the Blackwood called to something within her. The night everything changed began like any other autumn evening. Storm clouds gathered with unusual speed, turning the sky the color of bruised plums. Miriam had sent Arya to gather herbs from the garden before the rain came, muttering about her rheumatism and the uselessness of strange-looking orphans. Arya worked quickly, her small hands efficient as she plucked sage and thyme. But the wind picked up with startling violence, tearing the basket from her grasp and sending it tumbling toward the forest edge. Without thinking, she chased after it, her worn shoes slipping on wet grass as the first drops of rain began to fall. The basket rolled and bounced, almost playfully evading her reaching fingers, leading her past the cultivated fields and into the wild grass that marked the boundary between safety and the unknown. By the time Arya caught it, she had crossed the invisible line that separated Thornwick from Blackwood Forest. The rain came down in sheets now, cold and relentless, soaking through Arya's thin dress in seconds. She turned to run back, but the world had transformed into a watercolor painting where all the landmarks blurred together. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating twisted trees that all looked identical, and thunder shook the ground beneath her feet. Panic finally found her as she stumbled deeper into the forest rather than out of it, her calls for help swallowed by the storm's fury. Branches snagged her hair and dress. Roots seemed to reach up to trip her, and the darkness grew so complete that she could barely see her own hands. When she finally collapsed against the base of an enormous oak tree, shivering and lost, Arya did something she had not done since her parents died. She cried, hot tears mixing with cold. Rain as fear and exhaustion overwhelmed her small frame. That was when she heard it. A sound that cut through the storm like a blade through silk. A low, rumbling growl that vibrated in her chest and made her bones ache with its depth. Arya's breath caught as she pressed herself against the tree trunk, searching the darkness for the source. 2 golden eyes appeared first, hovering at an impossible height, glowing with their own inner fire. Then the lightning flashed again, and Arya saw the beast in its entirety. The wolf was massive beyond comprehension, standing taller than a horse with shoulders broad enough to carry 3 men. Its fur was black as a moonless night, matted and wild, and its teeth were the length of daggers. Scars crisscrossed its muzzle and body, telling stories of battles and survival. This was the creature that had haunted Thornwick for decades, the monster that stole children and terrorized the brave. This was death itself given form and fang. But Arya did not scream. She stared into those golden eyes and saw something that stopped her terror cold. Pain. Loneliness. A suffering so profound it made her own grief seem small. The wolf moved closer, each step deliberate and careful, its massive head lowering until it was level with her tiny body. She could feel its breath, hot against her frozen skin, could smell earth and rain and something wild. Any rational person would have run or fainted or prepared for the end. Arya, guided by an instinct she did not understand, reached out with trembling hands and wrapped her arms around the wolf's enormous neck. She pressed her face into its wet fur and whispered words that came from somewhere deeper than thought. "You are not a monster. You are lonely. I understand. I am lonely too. Please do not be afraid. I will not hurt you." The transformation began instantly. Light exploded from where Arya's hands touched fur, silver and brilliant, forcing her to squeeze her eyes shut against its intensity. The wolf's body convulsed beneath her embrace, shrinking and shifting, bones cracking and reforming with sounds that should have been horrifying, but somehow felt like a symphony reaching its crescendo. When the light faded and Arya dared to open her eyes, she was no longer holding a beast. Her arms encircled the shoulders of a man, collapsed in the mud, naked and shaking, his skin marked with the same scars that had decorated the wolf's hide. He looked up at her with eyes still molten gold, now set, in a face that was devastatingly beautiful, despite the gauntness that spoke of long suffering. His hair was as black as his fur had been, falling past his shoulders in tangled waves. And when he spoke, his voice was rough from decades of disuse. "What have you done, little one? What impossible thing have you done?" The man's words were barely more than a whisper, shock and wonder mixing in equal measure. Arya, displaying the strange fearlessness that had always set her apart, reached out and touched his face with her small hand. "I freed you," she said simply, as if breaking ancient curses was something children did every day. The man caught her hand, his own shaking, and for a moment he simply stared at her as if she were the supernatural creature rather than him. Then he pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her small frame with desperate gentleness, and wept. They stayed like that, the freed wolf and the silver-haired child, while the storm raged around them and something fundamental in the fabric of fate shifted into a new configuration. The man's name was Cale Nightborn, and his story was the kind that legends were built upon. He had been the Alpha King 3 decades prior, ruler of the largest werewolf pack in the Northern Territories, a leader known for his strength and his unwavering sense of justice. His reign had been marked by peace between the packs and cautious coexistence with humans. A delicate balance he had maintained through both diplomacy and the kind of power that made challengers think twice. But power always attracted those who craved it, and Cale's refusal to marry Morgana, a witch of considerable ability and even greater ambition, had been his downfall. Scorned and furious, Morgana had crafted a curse specifically designed to torture him. She stripped away his humanity but left his mind intact, transforming him into a beast that could never shift back, never speak, never return to his people. She bound him to the Blackwood Forest, making it impossible for him to leave, and twisted the magic so that anyone who saw his wolf form would feel only terror, ensuring he could never seek help. The cruelest part was that she made him watch as his beta, Marcus Ironjaw, seized control of his pack and spread the lie that Cale had gone mad and had to be put down for everyone's safety. For 30 years, Cale had existed in torture, his wolf form slowly going feral from isolation, while his human consciousness screamed silently inside. He had tried everything to break the curse. He had sought out the stone circle, hoping its ancient magic might counter Morgana's spell, but it had only amplified his pain. He had attempted to communicate with villagers who wandered too close, but Morgana's magic ensured they saw only a monster. In his darkest moments, driven by the wolf's instincts and his own despair, he had done things he was not proud of. The missing children haunted him, because while he had never harmed them, he had been unable to stop the actual threats in the forest, and his monstrous presence had taken the blame. He had resigned himself to an eternity of this cursed existence, his humanity eroding a little more each year, until a child with silver hair and impossible courage had embraced him and shattered 30 years of suffering with pure, inexplicable compassion. As Kyle explained all this to Arya in the days that followed, sheltering in a cave system he had discovered deep in the Blackwood, she listened with the serious attention of someone far older than 7. She shared her own story in return. The loss of her parents, her isolation in Thornwick, the way people looked at her like she was something other. Kale, despite the decades he had spent as a beast, found himself drawn to this strange child in ways that transcended gratitude. There was something about her, something in the way moonlight seemed to cling to her silver hair, and the violet of her eyes deepened when she was thoughtful. He had lived among werewolves and supernatural beings, long enough to recognize when someone was more than they appeared. One night, as Arya slept curled against his side for warmth, Kyle examined her more carefully with senses newly returned to him. Her scent was wrong for a human child. Beneath the smell of herbs and rain, there was something wild and ancient, something that called to his wolf in recognition, rather than dominance or submission. When Arya woke, Kyle asked her questions about her parents, about whether she had ever felt different, stronger, more aware than other children. Arya's answers confirmed what he had begun to suspect. Her parents had been secretive about their past, moving to Thornwick when Arya's mother was already heavy with child, never speaking of where they came from, or why they had chosen such an isolated village. Arya remembered her mother singing in a language she did not recognize, her father's unusual strength when he thought no one was watching. She remembered that her parents had died not from sickness as everyone believed, but after drinking tea that Miriam had prepared, the old woman's kindness afterward seeming more like guilt than charity. Kale's expression had grown dark as Arya spoke, pieces of a larger puzzle falling into terrible place. He asked permission to examine her more closely, using the supernatural senses that all werewolves possessed, and what he discovered made him go very still. Arya was not human. She was lunar-born, one of the rarest types of werewolf, a bloodline so ancient and powerful that most believed it extinct. Lunar-born appeared human until their first transformation, which typically occurred during adolescence, but they carried supernatural abilities from birth. The ability to break curses, to heal wounds that should be fatal, to inspire absolute loyalty or absolute terror depending on their will. They were born only during blood moons, only to parents who carried the dormant gene, and only when the supernatural world itself needed them for some greater purpose. The last recorded lunar-born had lived 2 centuries prior and had united warring packs into a confederation that lasted 3 generations. Morgana must have discovered that Arya's parents were sheltering their lunar daughter and had them eliminated, knowing that a lunar-born could undo any curse, end any dark magic, and pose a threat to those who trafficked in forbidden power. Miriam had likely been Morgana's agent, though whether willing or compelled was unclear. What was crystal clear was that Arya was in danger, had always been in danger, and would continue to be in danger until she either came into her full power or was destroyed by those who feared that power. If you enjoyed discovering Arya's true nature, please like this video and let me know in the comments what you think her powers will fully manifest as when she grows up. Do not forget to subscribe so you do not miss the next part of this incredible journey, because things are about to get even more intense. Kale made a decision that night that would alter both their fates. He could not return Arya to Thornwick where Morgana's influence clearly reached, but neither could he keep her in the Blackwood where she would grow up wild and ignorant of the supernatural world she belonged to. Instead, he would take her to the one place that might offer sanctuary, the Sanctuary of the Silver Moon, a hidden compound where supernatural beings who rejected pack politics lived in peaceful isolation. It was a week's journey through dangerous territory, but Kyle's reputation, even after 30 years, still carried weight in certain circles. They traveled at night, Kyle teaching Arya how to move silently through the forest, how to read the signs that indicated danger, how to trust her instincts that were becoming sharper each day. She was a quick study, her lunar nature giving her advantages even in her untransformed state. She could see in near darkness, could smell the difference between a normal animal and a supernatural one, could sense hostility or friendliness in creatures they encountered. The journey was not without incident. On the third night, they were tracked by a group of rogue werewolves, outcasts from various packs who survived by preying on the weak. They had heard rumors of Kale's return, whispers that the cursed Alpha King walked again, and they wanted to test whether the legend matched reality. Kale had tried to avoid confrontation, knowing that drawing attention to Arya's existence was dangerous. But the rogues were persistent and stupid. When they finally attacked, Kale discovered that 30 years as a beast had not diminished his fighting ability. If anything, it had honed his instincts to a razor's edge. He tore through the rogues with brutal efficiency, his human form just as deadly as his wolf had been, protecting Arya with the kind of violence that reminded the supernatural world why he had been called king. But it was Arya who ended the fight. When the rogue leader, a scarred brute named Garrett, lunged past Kale's defenses toward the child, something in Arya awakened. Her eyes flared with silver light, and her small voice rang out with a command that no werewolf could disobey. Stop. Garrett froze mid-leap, his body locked in place by power that should not exist in an untransformed child. The remaining rogues collapsed to their knees, heads bowed, whimpering in submission to an authority their wolves recognized, even if their human minds could not comprehend it. Arya stood in the center of their circle, silver light cascading from her skin like moonbeams made solid, her violet eyes now glowing with the same intensity as Kale's gold. When she spoke again, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate with the very earth beneath them. You will leave this place and never hunt the innocent again. You will find honest purpose, or you will find your end. This is your only warning. The rogues fled into the darkness, terror overriding pride, and Arya's light faded as quickly as it had appeared. She swayed on her feet, suddenly exhausted, and Kale caught her before she fell. He held her close, his heart pounding not with fear but with awe. She had just demonstrated an alpha command, something that should be impossible for a child, for an untransformed wolf, for anyone except a pack's ruling authority. This little girl was going to reshape the supernatural world, whether she intended to or not. They reached the sanctuary of the Silver Moon as dawn broke on the 8th day, both of them exhausted and filthy but alive. The sanctuary was beautiful in its simplicity, a collection of wooden buildings arranged in a clearing where natural hot springs bubbled from the earth, and ancient trees grew in perfect circles. The inhabitants were a mix of supernatural beings who had chosen peace over power, werewolves who rejected pack violence, witches who practiced healing rather than hexing, even a few vampires who had grown weary of endless nights and wanted something resembling a normal existence. The sanctuary was led by Elena Moonwhisper, a werewolf of Kale's generation who had been his childhood friend before their paths diverged. She took one look at Kale standing in her doorway, scarred and haunted but finally human, with a silver-haired child holding his hand, and burst into tears. The reunion was emotional and complicated. 3 decades of assumed death and grief colliding with impossible reality. But Elena's shock quickly turned to professional concern when Kale explained about Arya's nature and the danger she represented to those in power. The sanctuary agreed to shelter Arya, to train her and protect her until she came of age and could make her own decisions about her place in the supernatural world. Kale, however, could not stay. Marcus Ironjaw had consolidated power over the decades, ruling Kale's former pack with an iron fist and expanding his influence to neighboring territories. If word spread that Kyle lived, that the curse was broken, Marcus would move to eliminate both him and anyone associated with him. More importantly, Morgana still lived, still practiced her dark magic, and still wanted Arya dead. Kale needed to move in shadows, to rebuild alliances, to prepare for the inevitable confrontation that would come. But leaving Arya felt like tearing out his own heart. In the short time they had spent together, She had become more than a child he protected. She had become the first person in 30 years to see him as something other than a monster, the one who had given him back his humanity, the one who made him want to be worthy of the title he had once carried. The night before Kyle planned to leave, Arya found him sitting by the hot springs, staring at the reflection of the moon on the water. She sat beside him in comfortable silence for a long moment before speaking. "You are going to leave me here," she said quietly. Not a question, but an acceptance. Kyle's throat tightened, but he nodded. "I have enemies, little moon. If they find you with me, they will hurt you to hurt me. Here you will be safe. Here you can learn what you need to become who you are meant to be." Arya considered this with the seriousness she brought to everything. "Will you come back?" "Always," Kale promised, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "I will watch over you, even when you cannot see me. I will make the world safer for you, and when you are ready, when you are strong enough to stand beside me rather than behind me, we will face our enemies together." Arya nodded, accepting this plan even though Kale could see the sadness in her violet eyes. She reached out and took his hand, her small fingers barely wrapping around his palm. "Promise me something else," she said. "Promise me you will not become the beast again. Not in your heart." Kale pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her silver hair, and made a promise he would spend the next decade keeping. 10 years passed in the sanctuary, and Arya grew from a strange, quiet child into a young woman who commanded attention without trying. Her silver hair grew long and thick, cascading down her back in waves that seemed to move with their own breeze. Her violet eyes deepened to the color of twilight, and her features refined into a beauty that was both ethereal and wild. But it was not her appearance that made the sanctuary residents watch, her with a mixture of respect and wariness. It was her power. Under Elena's guidance, Arya learned to control the abilities that marked her as lunar-born. She could heal injuries with a touch, her hands glowing with silver light as she knit broken bones and closed wounds. She could sense supernatural beings from miles away, distinguishing between werewolf and witch and vampire with the same ease others might differentiate colors. She could communicate with animals, particularly wolves, in ways that suggested she heard their thoughts as clearly as spoken words. And she could command obedience from any werewolf she chose, her alpha authority growing stronger each year despite having never transformed herself. That was the mystery that troubled Elena and the other teachers. Arya should have had her first shift by now. Most werewolves transformed for the first time between 12 and 14 years old, triggered by puberty and the full moon. Arya was 17 and had experienced dozens of full moons without so much as a hint of fur. Medical examinations confirmed she was definitely a werewolf. Her biology was clearly supernatural, but something prevented her transformation. Elena theorized that because Arya was lunar-born, her development followed different rules, that she might not shift until some specific condition was met, or some destiny fulfilled. Others whispered darker theories, that Morgana had cursed Arya in the womb, that breaking Kale's curse had somehow transferred it to her, that she was incomplete in some fundamental way. Arya herself did not speak much about it. But Kyle, who visited the sanctuary twice a year under cover of darkness, saw the frustration in her eyes. She felt broken, unable to access the most basic aspect of her nature, powerful in every way except the one that mattered most. Kale's visits were the highlight of Arya's existence, moments she counted down to with an anticipation that grew more intense each year. He would arrive without warning, slipping past the sanctuary's defenses like smoke, and always found her no matter where she was. They would spend hours talking, walking through the forest together, while Kale shared stories of his travels and the progress he had made. He had not been idle during their separation. He had methodically contacted old allies, werewolves who remembered his reign and were disillusioned with Marcus's brutal leadership. He had gathered intelligence on Morgana's activities, tracking her movements and learning the extent of her power. He had discovered that Marcus and Morgana were working together, the witch providing magical support in exchange for Marcus's pack, giving her access to supernatural resources and test subjects for her experiments. The alliance was as corrupt as it was dangerous, and both needed to be removed before the supernatural world descended into chaos. But the visits were not just strategic briefings. As Arya grew older, the dynamic between her and Kale shifted in ways neither fully acknowledged, but both felt acutely. Kyle watched Arya transform from the child who had saved him into a woman of stunning beauty and devastating power, and found himself struggling with feelings he knew were inappropriate. She was 17. He was physically in his early 40s, though chronologically much older if you counted his cursed years. He had watched her grow up. He had protected her. He should have seen her as something like a daughter. But his wolf had imprinted on her from that first embrace in the storm, recognizing her as something more fundamental than family. Mate, his instincts whispered, a word that both thrilled and horrified him. Arya, for her part, no longer looked at Kale with childish adoration, but with an intensity that made his chest tighten. She had grown up hearing stories of the legendary Alpha King, had trained specifically to be strong enough to stand beside him, had spent a decade preparing for a future that revolved around him. Her feelings were complicated, tangled up in gratitude and admiration, and something deeper that she was only beginning to understand. The tension between them came to a head on Arya's 17th birthday. The sanctuary held a celebration in her honor, a gathering of the supernatural community that had watched her grow and trained her. But Arya barely participated. Her attention fixed on the forest edge, where she knew Kyle was watching from the shadows. When the festivities wound down and the other residents retired, Arya slipped away and found him exactly where she expected, in the clearing where they always met. Kale stood with his back to her, staring up at the full moon that hung heavy and silver in the night sky. He did not turn when she approached, but his voice carried clearly in the quiet night. "You should not be here, little moon. Tonight is dangerous for both of us." Arya ignored the warning and closed the distance between them until she stood directly behind him. Close. Enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. "I am not a child anymore, Kyle. Stop treating me like I am fragile." Kyle finally turned, and Arya's breath caught at the expression on his face. His golden eyes were blazing with barely controlled emotion, his jaw tight, every muscle in his body tense as if holding himself back from something. "That is precisely the problem," he said roughly. "You are not a child. You are powerful and beautiful and far too important to tie yourself to someone like me. I have enemies, Arya. I have blood on my hands and darkness in my past. You deserve better than a broken king who spent 3 decades as a monster." Arya stepped closer, refusing to be pushed away. "You are not broken. You are the strongest person I know. You survived what would have destroyed anyone else. You protected me when I had nothing. You come back for me even though it puts you in danger. You are exactly what I want." The words hung between them, a confession and a challenge. And Kale's control finally shattered. He reached for her, one hand cupping her face with a gentleness that contrasted with the hunger in his eyes. "This is wrong," he whispered, even as he leaned closer. "You are too young. I am too damaged. There are 1,000 reasons why we should not do this." Arya met his gaze steadily, her own hands coming up to grip his shirt, holding him in place. "Then give me one good reason why we should not." Kyle tried. He genuinely tried to think of an argument that would be stronger than the pull between them. But his mind offered nothing. Instead, he closed the remaining distance and kissed her with a desperation that spoke of 10 years of denial. Arya responded with equal intensity, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his as if she could merge them into a single being. The kiss was electric and overwhelming, and when they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, Kale's control hanging by the thinnest thread. "We cannot do this," he said again, but the conviction in his voice had crumbled. "Not yet. Not while you are in danger. While I am still fighting to reclaim what was stolen. When I can offer you a world where you are safe, where you are recognized for what you are, then we will revisit this. But right now, little moon, I need you to trust me enough to wait." Arya wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she did not need safety or recognition or anything except him. but she saw the resolve in Kale's eyes and knew pushing would only cause pain. So she nodded, stepping back even though it felt like tearing away part of herself. "I will wait," she agreed quietly. "But not forever, Kale. I am not as patient as you think." Kale's smile was sad and tender. "I would not expect you to be." Then he did something he had never done before. He shifted, his body flowing from human to wolf in a transformation so smooth it seemed like water changing shape. The black wolf stood before her, massive and powerful, but no longer terrifying. He lowered his head, and Arya pressed her forehead against his muzzle, sharing a moment of wordless understanding. Then he was gone, disappearing into the forest, leaving Arya standing in the moonlight with the taste of him still on her lips, and a determination in her heart that burned brighter than any star. The next 3 months passed in a blur of training and preparation. Elena noticed the change in Arya immediately, the newfound focus that bordered on obsession. Arya threw herself into mastering every skill the sanctuary could teach, pushing her body and power to their limits. She studied werewolf politics and pack dynamics, learning the intricate web of alliances and enmities that defined supernatural society. She practiced combat with anyone willing to spar, her speed and strength increasing daily even without her wolf form. She asked questions about Marcus Ironjaw and Morgana, memorizing every detail, building a mental picture of the enemies she would eventually face. Elena tried to counsel patience, reminding Arya that she was still young and there was no rush. But Arya's response was always the same. "Kale has waited long enough. I will not make him wait any longer than necessary." The turning point came on a night when the moon hung red in the sky, a blood moon that occurred only once every few years. Arya stood in the same clearing where Kale had kissed her, drawn there by an instinct she did not question. The air felt charged with energy, making her skin tingle and her senses sharpen to painful clarity. She could hear conversations happening in the sanctuary buildings hundreds of yards away. She could smell the individual scents of every creature in the forest. She could feel the earth's heartbeat thrumming through the soles of her bare feet. And then, the pain started. It began as a warmth in her chest that rapidly became burning heat spreading through her entire body. Arya gasped, falling to her knees as her bones began to shift and crack. This was it. Finally, the transformation she had waited years to experience. But something was wrong. The pain was too intense, the changes too violent. Normal first shifts were difficult, but manageable. This felt like her body was tearing itself apart and rebuilding from the inside out. Elena found her there, drawn by screams that echoed through the sanctuary, and immediately recognized what was happening. Arya's lunar nature meant her first transformation would be different. More powerful, more dangerous. Elena called for help, for the strongest werewolves in the sanctuary to hold Arya down before she hurt herself or others in her pain. But as they approached, Arya's power exploded outward in a wave of silver light that knocked everyone back. Her body convulsed, human form fighting against the wolf trying to emerge, and Elena realized with horror that Arya might not survive this. Lunar-born transformations were supposed to be guided by another of their kind, someone who understood the unique nature of their power. But there were no other Lunars left. Elena did the only thing she could think of. She sent a supernatural SOS, a pulse of energy that would reach any werewolf within 100 miles, calling for help with an urgency that could not be ignored. Kyle was 50 miles away when he felt Elena's call. He was in the middle of a delicate negotiation with a pack that had tentatively agreed to support him against Marcus. But the moment that desperate pulse hit him, he abandoned everything. He shifted mid-stride and ran, his powerful wolf form eating up the distance with supernatural speed. He could feel Arya's distress through a connection he did not fully understand, could sense her pain and fear, and the terrible wrongness of a transformation going catastrophically wrong. He pushed himself harder than he ever had, his lungs burning and muscles screaming. But fear drove him beyond physical limitations. She had saved him once. He would not let her die, because he was not there to save her in return. He burst into the sanctuary clearing just as Arya's screams reached a crescendo. Her body caught between forms, neither fully human nor fully wolf, her skin rippling with fur that appeared and disappeared, her bones breaking and healing and breaking again. Kale shifted back to human form and pushed through the crowd of terrified onlookers. He dropped to his knees beside Arya, ignoring Elena's warnings about the danger, and pulled Arya's convulsing body into his arms. His touch seemed to ground her, the wild thrashing calming slightly, and he spoke directly into her ear with a voice that carried both command and comfort. "Listen to me, little moon. I know it hurts. I know you are frightened. But you are strong enough for this. You are lunar born, blessed by the moon itself, and you will not let this break you." He pressed his forehead against hers, letting his own wolf rise to the surface, sharing his strength and experience through the contact. "Feel my wolf, Arya. Let it guide yours. We are meant to do this together. You are not alone. You have never been alone. I am here, and I will always be here." Something in Arya responded to his words, to his presence, to the absolute certainty in his voice. The chaotic energy swirling through her body began to organize, following the pattern Kale's wolf provided. Her bones settled into new configurations with one final agonizing crack. And then suddenly the pain was gone. In Kale's arms lay a wolf, unlike any he had ever seen. She was smaller than most werewolves, more graceful in build, but her fur was pure silver that seemed to glow with its own internal light. Her eyes, when they opened, were the same violet as her human form, but now held a depth and awareness that marked her as something extraordinary. The lunar mark, a crescent moon symbol, blazed on her forehead in white that stood out even against her silver fur. She was absolutely beautiful and utterly deadly, and when she looked up at Kyle, her wolf recognized its mate with a certainty that transcended any human doubt or hesitation. The bond snapped into place between them, with a force that staggered Kyle, even though he had been expecting it. This was not the gentle recognition of compatible souls, but the absolute, irrevocable binding of true mates. His wolf howled in triumph inside his mind, finally claiming what it had known belonged to them for 10 years. Arya's wolf responded with a howl of her own, the sound, carrying a harmonic quality that made every werewolf in the sanctuary feel it in their bones. She stood on shaky legs, her new wolf body unfamiliar, and pressed against Kale's human form. He wrapped his arms around her wolf, burying his face in her silver fur, and felt something inside him that had been broken since his curse finally heal completely. They stayed like that for a long moment, oblivious to their audience. Two souls that had been orbiting each other finally colliding into alignment. Elena's voice broke through their private moment. "Well," she said dryly, trying to cover her own emotional reaction to what she had just witnessed. "That was dramatic even for a lunar transformation. Are you both quite finished nearly giving me a heart attack?" Kyle looked up with a sheepish expression that Elena had not seen in decades, and Arya shifted back to human form with an ease that should have been impossible for someone who had just completed their first transformation. She remained in Kale's arms, now gloriously naked and completely unconcerned about it, her violet eyes bright with joy and relief. "I did it," she said wonderingly. "I finally did it, and you came. You were not supposed to be here yet, but you came anyway." Kale's smile was tender, as he shrugged out of his jacket and wrapped it around her. "Of course I came, little moon. Did you really think anything could keep me away when you needed me?" The dynamics at the sanctuary shifted after that night. Arya was no longer a student to be trained and protected, but a fully realized lunar werewolf whose power exceeded most of her former teachers. More importantly, Kale's presence became permanent. He and Arya were true mates now, the bond recognized and accepted by supernatural law, which meant separating them would be not only cruel, but potentially dangerous. Bonded mates who spent too much time apart experienced physical and psychological deterioration, their wolves literally pining to death without their other half. Kyle moved into the sanctuary officially, helping to fortify its defenses while continuing to build his network of allies. He and Arya were careful to respect the boundaries of her age, their relationship remaining chaste despite the mate bond pulling them together. But everyone could see it was only a matter of time before that changed as well. During this period, Kyle taught Arya everything he knew about being an alpha. He explained that leadership was not about dominance or fear, but about responsibility and service. An alpha's power came not from their ability to force obedience, but from their pack's willing trust and loyalty. He shared stories of his own mistakes during his original reign, times when he had prioritized strength over compassion, or tradition over innovation. He wanted Arya to be a better leader than he had been, to avoid the pitfalls that had partially led to his downfall. Arya absorbed these lessons eagerly, her natural charisma and genuine care for others, combining with Chaol's tactical knowledge to create a leadership style that was both powerful and nurturing. When she practiced her alpha command now, it did not feel like oppression, but like inspiration, as if she was calling forth the best version of whoever she directed it toward. If you are enjoying Arya and Chaol's journey, make sure you are subscribed to this channel so you do not miss what happens next. Trust me, the confrontation with Marcus and Morgana is going to be absolutely epic, and you will want to see how Arya's powers play into the final battle. Leave a comment telling me which supernatural romance you want to see next. 6 months after Arya's transformation, the carefully built house of cards that Marcus had constructed began to collapse. Werewolves who had been loyal to Chaol's memory started openly questioning Marcus's leadership. Packs that had been absorbed through intimidation began seeking independence. Rumors spread that the true Alpha King lived, that he had returned more powerful than ever, and was gathering support. Marcus, never the strategic thinker Chaol was, responded with increasing violence and paranoia. He executed suspected traitors without trial, imposed harsh restrictions on pack members, and relied more heavily on Morgana's magic to maintain control. This heavy-handed approach only accelerated his loss of support, creating exactly the opening Chaol had been waiting for. The time for hiding and planning was over. It was time to reclaim what had been stolen. Chaol called a gathering of all the allied packs, a meeting held in neutral territory under the full moon. Representatives from 24 packs attended, some out of loyalty to Chaol's memory, others out of hatred for Marcus's tyranny, and a few motivated purely by the chaos and opportunity that regime change would bring. Chaol stood before them, no longer the scarred and broken creature that had emerged from his curse, but a leader in full command of his power. Beside him stood Arya, her silver fur gleaming in the moonlight, her presence alone proof that legends could be real. Chaol spoke with the eloquence and passion that had made him a great Alpha King decades before, laying out Marcus's crimes, Morgana's corruption, and the vision he had for a supernatural society built on justice rather than fear. But it was Arya who sealed their commitment. She stepped forward and released her alpha command, not to force obedience but to inspire courage. Her voice rang with harmonics that made every wolf present feel seen and valued. "We are not asking you to die for us. We are asking you to stand with us so that our children do not have to live in fear. We are asking you to be brave for one battle so that we can build peace that lasts generations. Will you stand?" The response was unanimous and thunderous. Every pack representative shifted to wolf form and howled their agreement, a chorus that echoed through the mountains and surely reached Marcus's ears in his stolen throne room. The alliance was forged, the army gathered, and the march toward confrontation began. They traveled as a combined force, hundreds of werewolves moving with purpose through territories that Marcus claimed as his own. Smaller packs joined them along the way, their numbers swelling until what had started as a rebellion looked like an unstoppable tide. Marcus, cornered and desperate, called upon Morgana to save him. The witch had been preparing for this possibility, developing magical weapons and defenses specifically designed to counter Chaol's strengths. She had created cursed silver that could wound even an Alpha King permanently, potions that could strip away a werewolf's connection to their pack, and rituals that could bind an entire army in place while she destroyed them at her leisure. The final confrontation took place at Nightborn Manor, the ancestral home that had once been Chaol's and that Marcus had claimed as his own. The building sat on a hilltop, overlooking the valley, a sprawling estate of dark stone and high towers that looked more like a fortress than a residence. Marcus's forces were smaller than the allied army, but they held the high ground and were supported by Morgana's magic. The battle began at sunset, and quickly proved to be nothing like the strategic warfare Cale had planned. Morgana unleashed her magical arsenal immediately. Bolts of corrupted energy that turned werewolves against their own packmates, illusions that made friends appear as enemies, and a creeping darkness that sapped strength and will. The allied army began to falter, confusion and fear spreading through ranks that had been confident moments before. Cale fought his way toward the manor, trying to reach Marcus directly, while Arya used her lunar abilities to counter Morgana's magic wherever possible, her silver light pushing back the darkness and breaking the witch's hold on affected werewolves. But Morgana had prepared too well. She had researched Lunar-born extensively, studied their weaknesses and limitations, and crafted a spell specifically designed to neutralize Arya. A massive binding circle erupted around Arya, carved into the ground and activated with Morgana's blood, trapping her inside a cage of magical energy. Arya threw herself against the barrier, but her power, so effective against werewolf manipulation and physical curses, could not break through pure magical construction. She was helpless, forced to watch as Morgana turned, her attention to Cale. The witch had waited 30 years for this moment, had nursed her hatred and rejection into something monstrous, and she intended to make Cale suffer before she killed him. She hit him with the same curse that had bound him before, attempting to strip away his humanity and trap him as a beast again. But she had not accounted for one crucial factor. Cale was no longer the solitary alpha who had refused her all those years ago. He was bonded to Arya, connected to her on a level that transcended magic, and that bond provided a conduit that flowed both ways. Arya felt the curse trying to take hold of Cale, and reacted with pure instinct. She could not break her own prison, but she could push her power through the bond, sending silver light flooding into Cale's body, and burning away Morgana's dark magic before it could take root. The witch screamed in fury, realizing her ace had been countered, and resorted to more direct violence. She summoned spectral chains that wrapped around Cale's limbs, burning his flesh and pinning him to the ground. She raised a blade of pure darkness, preparing to drive it through his heart, but she made one final, fatal mistake. She took her eyes off Arya. The lunar werewolf had been studying the binding circle, using her enhanced senses to analyze its structure, and she finally understood its weakness. It was designed to contain her power, but not necessarily her physical form. Arya shifted to human, her smaller mass giving her just enough room to slip through a gap in the magical barrier. The moment she was free, she shifted back to wolf and launched herself at Morgana with a speed that seemed to bend reality. Morgana barely had time to raise a shield before Arya collided with it, the impact sending both of them tumbling away from Cale. The witch was powerful and experienced, but Arya was lunar-born and fighting to protect her mate, a combination that made her nearly unstoppable. They fought across the battlefield, magic against supernatural might, dark energy against silver light. Morgana threw everything she had at Arya, curses that had destroyed armies and spells that had toppled kingdoms. But nothing could touch the silver wolf who moved like moonlight given form. When Arya finally got past Morgana's defenses and clamped her jaws around the witch's throat, she did not kill immediately. Instead, she looked into Morgana's terrified eyes and spoke directly into her mind, a lunar ability that allowed communication even in wolf form. You cursed a good man for refusing to love you. You killed my parents for daring to protect me. You have caused suffering for decades, because you could not accept that power does not entitle you to people's hearts. Your reign of cruelty ends now. Arya's jaws closed, and Morgana's scream cut off abruptly. The witch's magic collapsed in on itself, all the active spells dissolving as their source was eliminated. Werewolves who had been fighting under compulsion suddenly found themselves free. The darkness covering the battlefield evaporated, replaced by natural twilight. Kyle struggled to his feet, the spectral chains crumbling to nothing, and shifted to human form as he approached where Arya stood over Morgana's body. He did not speak, simply pulled Arya into his arms and held her tightly, both of them shaking with adrenaline and relief. Around them, the battle had turned decisively. Without Morgana's support, Marcus's forces were being overwhelmed by the Allied army. Marcus himself tried to flee but was cornered by werewolves who had suffered under his rule and wanted justice. They brought Marcus to Cale in chains, the usurper bloodied and defeated but still defiant. "You think killing me makes you king again," Marcus spat. "You think these fools will follow you after you abandoned them for 30 years? Cale regarded his former beta with an expression that held more pity than anger. "I did not abandon them, Marcus. I was cursed and imprisoned. While you lied about my death and seized power you never earned. But I am not going to kill you." Arya stepped forward, still in wolf form, her violet eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made him shrink back. "You will face trial, Marcus Ironjaw. Every pack you oppressed will have the opportunity to testify to your crimes. Every werewolf you harmed will see justice done. And when you are sentenced, it will be by the voice of those you sought to dominate, not by the violence you used to. Rule." Marcus laughed bitterly. "A trial? You think any of them will show mercy?" Cale's smile was cold. "Mercy is something you should have considered before you became a tyrant. But justice is not the same as mercy, and justice will be what you receive." The trial took place over 3 days. A gathering of supernatural beings from across the territories. Pack after pack came forward with evidence of Marcus's atrocities, corruption, and abuse of power. The testimonies were heartbreaking and damning, painting a picture of a leader who had ruled through fear and enriched himself at his people's expense. When it came time for sentencing, the gathered packs were unanimous. Marcus would be stripped of his wolf, rendered human and powerless, and exiled to live the remainder of his life among the humans he had always considered beneath him. It was a fate worse than death for a werewolf, losing the essential part of their identity. But it was justice rather than revenge. Arya performed the ritual, herself, her lunar power uniquely suited to severing Marcus's connection to his wolf. When it was done, Marcus collapsed to the ground, sobbing at the loss, and was escorted away to begin his exile. The era of his tyranny was over. In the aftermath of the battle and trial, the supernatural community faced a question of leadership. Cale was the rightful Alpha King, his claim uncontested, and his legend only enhanced by everything he had endured and overcome. But Cale surprised everyone by refusing to simply reclaim his throne. He called another gathering and stood before the assembled packs with Arya at his side. "For decades, this world has functioned on a system where the strongest wolf ruled by right of power," he said clearly. "That system allowed someone like Marcus to seize control through violence. That system made it possible for a witch like Morgana to manipulate from the shadows. That system failed you, and it failed me. I propose something different. A council of alphas, representing every major pack, making decisions together. Checks and balances that prevent any one individual from accumulating too much power. Laws that apply equally to everyone, from the lowest Omega to the highest King. A system built on consent and cooperation, rather than dominance and fear." The proposal was met with shocked silence. What Kyle was suggesting was revolutionary, a complete restructuring of supernatural society. Arya amplified his voice with her alpha command, ensuring everyone understood the depth of his commitment. "My mate and I will serve this council if you choose to establish it. We will use our power to protect and guide, but we will not rule as tyrants. We will not perpetuate the system that allowed my curse and your suffering. We will build something better, together, or we will build nothing at all." The debate that followed lasted hours, with some supporting Cale's vision and others arguing for a return to traditional hierarchy. But slowly, the weight of evidence from Marcus's reign tipped the balance. The council system was adopted with modifications and amendments, creating a new supernatural government that shared power among many rather than concentrating it in one. 3 months later, Cale and Arya stood together in a ceremony that was both ancient and unprecedented. They formalized their mate bond in front of the entire supernatural community, exchanging vows that promised partnership and equality. Arya wore a dress the color of moonlight, her silver hair crowned with flowers, and Cale had never seen anything more beautiful. When they kissed to seal their bond, silver light erupted from Arya and wrapped around them both, visible proof of their connection. The celebration lasted 3 days, a joy and hope filling the air that had been absent from supernatural society for decades. Kale and Arya moved into Nightbourne Manor, reclaiming it from the darkness Marcus had brought, and transforming it into a center of learning and justice. They opened it to any supernatural being seeking sanctuary or guidance, making it a symbol of the new era they were building together. Arya threw herself into her role with characteristic intensity. She established schools for young werewolves, teaching them not just how to shift and hunt, but how to navigate the human world safely. She created support systems for Omegas who had been marginalized under the old hierarchy, giving them education and opportunities to develop their own strength. She worked with witches who practiced ethical magic to develop healing centers and research facilities. Most importantly, she made it her mission to find and protect other lunar-born children if any existed, ensuring they never faced the danger and isolation she had experienced. Kale supported her in all of this, while handling the political and defensive aspects of their new society, negotiating with human governments, and managing threats from supernatural beings who rejected the council system. They were partners in every sense, their strengths complementing each other perfectly. 2 years after the battle at Nightbourne Manor, on a night when the moon hung full and silver in a cloudless sky, Arya discovered she was pregnant. She told Kale in the same clearing where he had first kissed her all those years ago, and his reaction was everything she had hoped for. He fell to his knees, pressing his face against her stomach, and wept with joy. They both knew that a child born to a lunar and an alpha king would be extraordinary, potentially the most powerful werewolf born in centuries. But more than that, this child would be born into a world they had fought to make better, a world where strength meant protection rather than oppression, where different was celebrated rather than feared, where love was not a weakness, but the foundation of everything strong. Their daughter was born on a blood moon, her tiny body already showing the silver hair and violet eyes that marked her as her mother's child. They named her Luna, after the moon that had guided them both, and her first cry echoed with harmonics that made every werewolf within 5 miles shift involuntarily. She was perfect and powerful and loved beyond measure. As Kale held his daughter while Arya rested, looking down at the impossibly small face and feeling her tiny hand grip his finger, he thought back to that stormy night so many years ago. A lost child had hugged a cursed beast and changed the fate of their entire world. Now that child was his mate, his queen, his everything, and they had created new life together. The broken king had been healed by an embrace, and in healing had found not just redemption, but a purpose and love he had never imagined possible. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were supernatural beings who rejected the council system and had to be dealt with. There were humans who discovered the supernatural world and reacted with fear. There were growing pains as ancient traditions collided with progressive reforms. But through it all, Kale and Arya faced everything together. Their bond unshakable, their commitment to building a better world unwavering. They had 3 more children over the years, each unique and powerful, each raised with the understanding that strength came with responsibility, and power was meant to serve rather than dominate. Nightbourne Manor became a beacon of hope and change, drawing supernatural beings from across the world who wanted to be part of something better. On their 20th anniversary, Kyle and Arya stood on the balcony of Nightbourne Manor, watching their children play in the gardens below, while the moon rose full and bright above them. Luna, now 18 and already showing leadership abilities that rivaled her parents, was teaching her younger siblings a tracking game. Their second daughter, Astrid, was practicing her healing magic on flowers, making them bloom out of season. Their twin sons, Orion and Atlas, were wrestling with the kind of enthusiastic violence only young werewolf boys could manage. Kale wrapped his arms around Arya from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Giving up a quiet life for all this chaos and responsibility?" Arya leaned back against him, a smile playing on her lips. "I was 7 years old and terrified in a storm, and I hugged a wolf because it looked lonely. Nothing about my life was ever going to be quiet, Kale," This chaos, this responsibility, this beautiful, complicated family and world we have built together, this is everything I never knew I needed. Cale turned her in his arms, studying the face he had loved for 2 decades, seeing both the woman she had become and traces of the fearless child who had saved him. I spent 30 years as a beast, believing I was beyond redemption, beyond love, beyond any future except endless suffering. And then you appeared and gave me back my humanity, with a hug and a few words. You are the miracle that should not have been possible, Arya Nightborn. Arya rose on her toes to kiss him softly. We saved each other, she corrected. You gave a lost child a purpose. I gave a cursed king a reason to hope. And together we built something that will outlast us both. That is not a miracle, my love. That is just what happens when 2 broken pieces find each other and refuse to stay broken. They kissed as the moon rose higher, bathing them in silver light that seemed to respond to Arya's lunar nature. Below them, their children laughed and played in a world their parents had fought to make safe. Beyond the manor, supernatural beings lived with dignity and rights they had never known under the old system. And somewhere in the forest that had once been Cale's prison, young werewolves trained together regardless of whether they were alphas, betas, or omegas, their worth measured by character rather than hierarchy. The little girl who had hugged the wolf everyone feared had not just freed an alpha king. She had started a revolution, transformed a society, and proved that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is show compassion when the world expects fear. And the wolf who had been saved by that hug had spent every day since proving himself worthy of her courage, building a legacy not of power and dominance, but of justice and love. Their story became legend, told to young werewolves across generations as proof that curses could be broken, that systems could be changed, and that true strength came not from inspiring fear, but from inspiring others to be brave. And every time the moon hung full and silver in the night sky, werewolves everywhere remembered the night a 7-year-old girl hugged a monster and revealed a king. The night everything changed. The night that proved love and courage could transform the world.